Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the virtual orientation recording and for taking the first few steps on the pathway for volunteering at Morris Animal Refuge. Good morning or evening or afternoon to you, whatever time you happen to be watching this. Um, and we appreciate you very much for wanting to join and help out at the shelter. Today, during the virtual orientation recording, we're going to be going through various aspects of volunteering at the shelter, a little bit of history and mission around the shelter itself, as well as some of the goals of our volunteer program, some of the details of the volunteer program, including the assignments that you can expect to be able to sign up for when you're volunteering at the shelter. As well as we're going to spend the bulk of the presentation today kind of talking about animal body language, being able to read it accurately and effectively, and being able to respond in a way that honors the animal's autonomy so that we're keeping all interactions as safe and enjoyable as possible with the animals. We will talk about dogs first, and then we will talk about cats afterward. And then at the end of the presentation, we will review what the next steps of the volunteer pathway process look like at Morris Animal Refuge. My name's Devlin Jarosky. I will be the person who performs your on-site training when you come in for your on-site training after this virtual orientation process is complete. And I'm really looking forward to working with all of you. So but let's go ahead and get started and dive into the presentation today. So in terms of some of the history of the shelter, Morris has been in the community for a long time. We were founded in 1874 by Elizabeth Morris. She was one of our nation's pioneers in animal welfare, and she really did a lot specifically around advocacy for local cat populations, unhoused cat populations, because at the time there weren't a lot of people really interested in working with the cats in the community. So she was really kind of progressive in her day in terms of moving that work forward. We are a 501(c)(3) organization, and that means we're a nonprofit organization. We're committed to adoption, education, and high quality care, with the goal of finding positive and humane outcomes for animals in need. That is our overarching mission statement here at Morris Animal Refuge. This is our shelter contact information, which you can also find on our website. We are located at 1242 Lombard Street, which is in Center City. A lot of our volunteers end up being close by and being able to walk to the shelter, which is kind of a luxury. A lot of volunteers also take public transit. If you're interested in driving, you can always reach out to us about the best places to find parking in the area. We do not have a parking lot, so it can be a little bit difficult finding parking in Center City, but there's usually plenty of opportunity to do so. You can always just feel free to reach out and ask about that. Our phone number is listed here as well as our website. And I am going to be your primary point of contact at the shelter. Again, my name is Devlin. I'm the volunteer and outreach coordinator. My phone number is listed here as well as my office hours. But for the days that I'm not in the office, on my weekends and when I'm out of the office, Elisa Rubenstein, who is our life-saving manager, will be your primary point of contact. And her phone number is listed here as well as her hours for when she's the primary contact for the volunteer cohort. Our shelter information is listed here. We are generally open every day of the week. We are closed to the public on Thursdays, so we don't do any intakes, so surrenders or transfers in of animals a lot of the time. And we also don't do any adoptions on Thursdays, but Thursdays are actually a great day to come into the shelter and volunteer with the animals in a sort of low-key environment, because there aren't a lot of other folks coming into the shelter on those days, and volunteers are still definitely welcome on those Thursdays. On Wednesdays and Fridays, we have late days, so we offer those to the public in case there are any people who are coming off of work, and that's the only time during their week that they can come in to check out the animals. So we are open a little bit later into the evening on those days, so you can expect volunteer shifts to extend a little bit later into those days. And our shelter adoption days and hours are also listed here. On Tuesdays and Saturdays, we are open for adoptions from 12 to 5 p.m. And then on Wednesdays and Fridays, we are open for adoptions from 12 to 7 p.m. During our adoption hours, you can expect foot traffic at the shelter to be a little bit more robust. So if you were more interested in working with the animals on the quieter days, I would plan the non-adoption days. But if you're interested in doing some liaising with the adopters and kind of talking up the animals, which is something we love our volunteers to do, then the adoption hours are a prime time for you to come in to volunteer. We also have volunteering at the PetSmart on Oregon Avenue in South Philadelphia. So that's a really great volunteer opportunity, and it's pretty unique in terms of the scope of the volunteer opportunities we have at the shelter. If you're interested in working with cats, the Oregon Avenue PetSmart opportunity is all around cats. We can't adopt dogs at the PetSmart, so we don't have any dogs at that location. However, our volunteers at the PetSmart are there basically every day of the week. You can see the schedule there outlined. Um, on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays, we have shifts from 6 to 8:30 p.m. On Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, we have shifts from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. So they're 2.5 to 3 hour long shifts, which, as we'll get into a little bit later, is a little bit longer than the shifts typically at the main site. Because during those shifts, those volunteers are responsible for a lot of kind of robust responsibilities. So feeding the cats and cleaning their kennels, making sure that everything looks nice and presentable and is comfortable for the cats over there, which is something that you don't really get to do too much at the main shelter because our animal care team typically focuses on that. At the PetSmart on Oregon Avenue, you also get to do enrichment with the cats, which is the main focus as well at the main site when working with any of the animals. However, at the PetSmart, we have the adoption center where we can let the cats out one at a time to kind of roam around and do some more kind of robust enrichment. Whereas at the main site, a lot of the enrichment has to stay contained to kennel side. And then at the Oregon Avenue PetSmart, our volunteers also assist with the adoption process. So if you're interested in being there for that moment that somebody is meeting their new forever companion for the first time and helping that introduction and meeting go off without a hitch, that is a really, I think, awesome part of that volunteer role. So if you're interested at all in that, you're going to be able to specify that when you submit a Volgistics application. And we always love recruiting volunteers for that location. So if you're interested, please make sure to specify that when you're filling out your Volgistics application. On the next few slides here, I've just got a couple of slides that um, go through what the shelter kind of looks like in case you haven't been there before. These are a little outdated, as you might be able to tell if you've been close to the shelter within the past few months or so. We actually have a really pretty new mural outside that features some of the animals that have been adopted over the years. But I like to do this for our volunteers just so that you can get a vision of what the shelter looks like and a little bit of understanding of what the space layout is. We are a relatively small shelter, so it is useful to get this before your on-site training shift. Although during your on-site training, we will, of course, do a tour of the shelter, and that'll be a lot more meaningful probably than just looking at these pictures. But this is the outside of the shelter. In our lobby, the primary thing to point out for you all is that we have a volunteer sign-in station. So it's that tablet that's mounted on the wall. Our volunteers sign in and sign out at the beginning and end of their shifts so that they can track their hours in Volgistics. Once you have your account set up, you will have a PIN for signing in and for signing out. And that's really the best way that we can track our volunteer progress at the shelter. So it's really important that you remember to sign in and out. We also have name badges available next to the sign-in station that you can wear while you are on site so that folks will know that you are a volunteer. We have 3 cat adoption rooms on site, and we usually have a max capacity of about 30 cats. Not all of them will be available for adoption at any given time, typically. Sometimes we'll be treating cats for illness. Sometimes cats will be hanging out in the time to adjust room so that they can settle down in the shelter if they came in with a high level of fear, anxiety, or stress. But any of the cats in the cat rooms are available for adoption. We have hand sanitizer stations in all of our adoption rooms. We'll talk about this again a little bit later, but it's good to reinforce to always make sure that you are sanitizing your hands between handling different animals. We want to make sure that we are minimizing the spread of contagious illnesses at the shelter, like upper respiratory infections. And the best way to do that is to make sure that our hands are clean in between different enrichment activities with different animals. We have two dog rooms at the shelter, our small dog room as well as our large dog room. We have a max capacity usually for about 7 small dogs and about 3 large dogs. So our dog population is smaller than our cat population because they have kind of greater space needs at the shelter. Um, but you can typically expect us to have anywhere from, I would say, usually like 4 on the lower end to 10 dogs in between the small and large dog rooms. Dividing the adoption floor from our administrative side of the shelter that has some of our specialized animal care rooms is our dog yard and garage area that kind of functions as 2 dog yards when we have the van pulled out. And then on our administrative side of the house, we have our life-saving team's office, our development team's office, our leadership offices, as well as some of our specialized animal care rooms, the cat holding space and the time to adjust room for our cats, as well as the isolation room for any animals who are sick with a contagious illness at the shelter. So for those of you who have volunteered at an animal shelter previously, you likely already know this. And it's pretty intuitive, but it can't be overstated the value that volunteers bring when volunteering at an animal shelter. That's part of why we're so grateful that you're interested in doing so, because volunteer work provides us an opportunity to deepen and expand the network of support and care around our animals. In the context of the shelter, animals are typically, if not stressed, then at least bored, because it is an odd environment. They have a lot of neighbors that they haven't really signed up to be living near. There are a lot of strange smells and sounds happening. And if one animal is stressed and making it known to the other animals, then the other animals, it kind of functions as sort of a contagion. That stress sort of spreads. So shelters are pretty stressful places for animals. So it's really important that we have folks who are coming in to work with the animals and giving them an opportunity to choose positive interactions for themselves, that are letting them kind of flex their autonomy, and feel like the space that they're occupying is a positive one for them. So I can't overstate how important it is just for you to come in and hang out with the animals. And through the vital work of our volunteer program, we seek to enrich the lives of our shelter population and expedite holistic, sustainable adoption outcomes. The less time that they spend in the shelter, the less time they potentially have in that kind of stressful environment, and the sooner they're going home with their forever companion. So we try to make sure that their shelter stay is as minimal as possible. We seek to offer meaningful hands-on personal and professional development for our volunteers. So the personal box often gets checked pretty easily. Most people who are interested in volunteering at an animal shelter are animal lovers, but we do try to emphasize the kind of rewarding nature of volunteering at the shelter. We do have a volunteer incentive program. So based on the amount of time that you volunteer at the shelter, it does open you up for different volunteer tiers, where you'll qualify for different volunteer rewards at those tiers. We find that that's a great way to sort of motivate volunteering. And on the professional development side, we try to offer opportunities around that as well. So as a nonprofit shelter, for example, we are able to offer fear-free training for free to our volunteers. Fear-free is one of the fundamental kind of philosophical methods of interacting with animals in a way that minimizes their fear, anxiety, and stress in a shelter environment. And we don't host Fear-Free. There's an organization called Fear-Free that does, but they have a really, really strong virtual training series for working with shelter animals hands-on in a way that really, really honors and respects their boundaries. It's a great training. And through us, you have access to it for free. And if you are interested in anything like pursuing a career in veterinary studies, or you're interested in animal welfare in a more kind of robust way than just shelter volunteering, then it does count as a professional credential in those contexts. And then finally, through the work of our volunteer program, we seek to streamline processes at the shelter to expand staff capacity for additional programming and animal care projects and initiatives. In working collaboratively to accomplish this mission, we are committed to, these are the five kind of pillars of the volunteer program. So first and foremost, the safety of our volunteers, animals, and staff. That's why so much of the presentation that you're watching right now, when we get into the back half of it, is going to be about reading animal body language accurately and effectively and responding appropriately with proper animal handling technique. We are committed to mutual measurable growth. So the ideal there is that you are coming to us with whatever skill set and knowledge base you already have around animal welfare. And you can be an expert all the way down to somebody who's never really interacted with a dog or a cat, but just wants a new life experience. We're committed to kind of getting you comfortable working with the animals in either of those contexts. And then as you learn and grow with the shelter, we're hopefully able to teach you some new things in terms of skills and knowledge base. You reinvest those back into the shelter, and it becomes a sort of mutually sustaining loop where we're both growing alongside each other. We're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So Morris Animal Refuge is an open adoption shelter, which means that we follow the American Humane Society's lead in terms of envisioning a role that shelters can play in their local communities that goes beyond simply a gatekeeper for deciding who gets the red stamp of disapproval for adopting an animal versus who gets the green stamp of approval for adopting an animal. So like all systems all across the world, we know that bias ends up seeping into those processes. And from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, shelters have historically kind of not served disadvantaged communities as well as they probably could have. So we are attempting to be on the right side of history and have a more sort of trust forward approach in communities. So what that means essentially is for our volunteer process or for our adoption process, we do not have landlord reference checks as a requirement. We do not do site visits. We try to be as minimally invasive in people's lives as possible because we want to respect their boundaries. So as long as we are ensuring that an animal is going to a safe home with somebody who's going to be able to provide the care for them that they will need, we try not to intrude into others' lives beyond that process. We welcome first-time pet parents, and we really just want to make sure that we are supporting community members in adopting animals rather than acting as a judgment role, which is kind of the role that shelters have historically played and the role that some shelters still currently do play. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a really fundamental part of our work outside of just our adoption process. It's a fundamental part of all of the work that we do at the shelter. So if you are volunteering at the shelter and you ever have any sort of accessibility issues, please touch base with me. We always want to make sure that the volunteer environment is as welcoming as possible and you feel embraced in terms of your volunteering at the shelter. And if you ever have any suggestions for improving the diversity of the environment or the equity of the environment or the inclusivity of the environment, again, always very open to having those conversations and making sure that we're always improving the environment at the shelter so that we're as welcoming as possible to folks of all walks of life. We are committed to trust, reliability, and active communication. So the shelter is a pretty dynamic space. Things change pretty rapidly sometimes on a day-to-day basis. And so what that means essentially is we might have a really big adoption day for our dogs where all of the dogs get adopted, which is great news, but it means for the next day, I might be sending out an email to you if you're signed up for a dog walking shift saying, hey, there aren't any dogs to walk at the shelter. So I always try to be as proactive as possible in terms of messaging out updates like that. And we just ask that you do the same thing. It obviously, things can get in the way. We all have other additional life commitments beyond just volunteering. We totally expect that. So it's totally understandable if you have to cancel a session. Please just give us a heads up if you can, so that if we do need to line up another volunteer to, say, work with the dogs on that day and provide some enrichment, we are able to do so. And then finally, we're committed to education and training. In addition to the fear-free training that I mentioned earlier, we do offer a summer lecture series on a variety of animal welfare topics with a variety of animal welfare experts in the community for both our interns and our volunteers at the shelter. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn when you're volunteering at the shelter. In terms of some of the basics, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the volunteer program now. We do have a dress code at the shelter. We require long pants and closed-toed shoes and sleeved shirts. That doesn't mean that you have to wear long sleeved shirts. It just means that we don't permit tank tops and the like. And we also don't recommend dangling jewelry. All of that is just to keep you as safe as possible when working with the animals. It's a functional dress code. So long pants and sleeved shirts help to minimize the amount of skin that is available for an animal to potentially bite or scratch, which, as we'll talk about later, is always an inherent risk of working with animals in the shelter environment. Closed-toed shoes ensure that if we are walking a dog, we are not potentially prone to, if the dog bolts, having the dog pull us to the ground and potentially injure us. And dangling jewelry really easily gets tangled up in slip leads and leashes as we're trying to work with the dogs. So that's why we don't recommend wearing that. And then, of course, this often goes without saying, but any unprofessional clothing, such as clothing with offensive language, is not permitted. As I said, we try to project and instill as welcoming an environment at the shelter as possible. And we always want to make sure that everybody is feeling welcome. So in addition to not wearing things that might have offensive language, we also are pretty strict about our anti-harassment policy. So if you ever feel that when you're volunteering at the shelter, you are the victim of any sort of harassment from an adopter, from another volunteer, from a staff member, please always approach us with that and let us know. We're committed to conducting investigations anytime that happens and taking the process very seriously. And we ask that you do the same thing. Just make sure that you're treating people the way that you want to be treated, and making sure that the environment is as welcoming as possible for everyone. Our shifts at the main site are typically in 1 hour increments. We do welcome volunteers to sign up for multiple shifts in a row. As long as you're bearing in mind the sort of equity part of that. So each time you sign up for a shift, that means that's a shift that another person can't sign up for. So while we do have volunteers who come into the shelter and spend an hour with the dogs and then spend an hour with the cats, which we definitely recommend doing if that's something that you're interested in doing, we ask that you don't sign up for like all the shifts in a given day, which means that other people wouldn't be able to sign up at all. When you're arriving for your shift at the shelter and when you're departing from your shift, you will sign in and out using the tablet that's in the lobby that I mentioned earlier. And we do ask that you wear a volunteer name badge. Those volunteer name badges will have a color-coded circle on them that will denote the level of animals that you're able to work with in the context of the shelter. We do have a hierarchy for determining animals who are a little bit more challenging to work with, and who might need a little bit more practiced hand to work with. And we do have a process for kind of graduating through those ranks and working with more challenging animals so that you can get that experience at the shelter. But that's why it's important to wear that volunteer name badge. And then in addition to myself and our life-saving manager, Elisa, you will also interact often with our animal care staff and generally most of the staff at the shelter. We're a pretty small staff, and you can feel free to ask questions about specific animals or item locations to just about anybody who is wearing a Morris staff t-shirt or sweater. In terms of the specific volunteer opportunities that we offer at the shelter, dog and cat enrichment and socialization is hands down the most important, and it's the most rewarding. It's what everybody wants to come in to do for the most part, to hang out with the cats and dogs in a meaningful way. So it'll include walking dogs, it'll include playing with them in the dog yard, as well as socializing with and playing with the cats in their kennels. We don't have a cat room for the cats the way that we do at the PetSmart on Oregon Avenue and the way that we have the dog yard for the dogs. However, the important thing is that kennel side enrichment for cats is still just as important. Um, so it's really important that we have volunteers come in and play with them at the sides of their kennels. And we can, of course, open the doors and interact with the cats and hold them if they're open to being held. Um, Photography and media is another big volunteering opportunity that we have at the shelter. So taking photos and videos for our website, for our social media and other shelter content is a need that we always have. Event support, so assisting our development team with guest check-in and event coordination and management. We have events that we offer throughout the year, all the way down from our kitten and puppy yoga sessions, all the way up to our annual fundraising gala, which is called the Fur Ball, which is an all hands on deck volunteering opportunity where we recruit upwards of 60 volunteers to help us make sure that that night goes off without a hitch. So if you're interested in doing animal wrangling at those events or guest check-in or event coordination, you'll primarily be working with our development team and specifically Emily on our development team rather than myself. But yeah, if you're interested in those offsite events, it's a great way to volunteer in a different kind of capacity at the shelter. We also have enrichment support shifts that are open for volunteers. So what differentiates enrichment shifts, so cat and dog enrichment versus enrichment support, which you will also see on the calendar when you're in Volgistics, is that enrichment support is more for creating toys and activities for our shelter animals than distributing those kind of structured activities and documenting individual animals' interests and preferences so that we have an idea of what they like and what they don't like so that we can ensure that we're giving them what they like while they're at the shelter and minimizing what they don't like. So that's a really vital part of volunteering as well. And if you are more kind of interested in the sort of like arts and crafts, for example, there will be opportunities to like put together do-it-yourself enrichment activities like snuffle mats. And this opportunity is really for volunteers who are interested in sort of more structured support for the animals because it's really important that each day we're giving them kind of interesting and stimulating things to focus on that will help relieve some of the boredom of being in the shelter. We will also have on a much more case-by-case basis administrative support and shelter support projects. So things like putting together adoption folders, assisting with records and filing, or assisting with organization and special projects on an as-needed basis. Those will be much fewer and farther between. Because our staff typically take the lead on those responsibilities, but you might see them posted in Volgistics sometimes with announcements around a specific volunteer activity. And then if you have a more specialized skill set, like if you are a dog trainer or if you have IT skills or a trade skill and you're interested in putting those skills to work to benefit the shelter, please touch base with me and we can work together to identify some additional ways that you might be able to help us out. The schedule for our on-site volunteering opportunities is as follows. So for cat enrichment and dog walking and yard enrichment, those shifts are available from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. daily and from 12 p.m. To 6 p.m. on Wednesdays and Fridays when we're open a little bit later. Walks are limited to 15 minutes on adoption days for our dog population. So on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, we limit those dog walks. And that's just so that we can ensure that if somebody comes to meet Fido at the shelter, that he's not on an hour-long walk and they don't have to hang out at the shelter waiting for him to get back. So walks are limited to 15 minutes on those adoption days. Photography, a lot of volunteers just do during their enrichment hours. They get photos of the cats and the dogs during those times because it's a great time to get action shots. We also have photography specific shifts available on Thursdays if you want to book time to just like really kind of focus in on doing photos with the animals. And most of the volunteers end up just using their phones for the cameras at the shelter, but we do have a camera that you can use if you don't want to use your own phone. And then Other assignments are typically as available, and they'll be listed in Volgistics. When we start in the new year, so January 2024, we are going to be offering enrichment support shifts as the first and final shift at each day so that we can make sure that animals are getting those kind of structured enrichment activities in addition to the kind of one-on-one time that the volunteers spend with them. So you can also expect the 12 p.m. shift and the 3 p.m. or the 5 p.m. shift to be enrichment support shifts. One of the hats that we ask you to wear when you're volunteering at the shelter is the kind of animal guardianship hat. So making sure that we're being a steward for the animals and reporting any sort of unusual medical or behavioral issues that we might see. So if an animal is struggling behaviorally or physically, please let a staff member know and don't be shy about reporting questionable behavior or symptoms. It could always be valuable information. You could be the first person who is at the ground zero of a cat sneezing, which means that they're coming down with an upper respiratory infection in some cases. And the sooner we can know about that, the sooner we can intervene and treat them and make sure that we are keeping them as healthy and happy as possible while they're at the shelter. So if you're noticing animals who are very nervous or hissing or growling, if you're noticing any sort of blood in a kennel, certainly, or an animal limping when they're out on a walk, please let us know. And this one is important. In the event of a bite or a scratch incident, all of this is important, but this is especially vital. Please notify a staff member immediately in the event of a bite or a scratch incident. If a bite or a scratch breaks skin, we do have to report that to the Philadelphia Health Department, and the animal has to serve a mandatory bite quarantine period. This is not meant as a punitive measure at all. It is instead just a community safety requirement issued by the health department and mandated by the health department. And it is to prevent and to treat any instances of the potential spread of rabies. Now, rabies is a scary word, of course. All of the animals at the shelter are vaccinated against rabies as soon as it is age appropriate and as soon as we have a veterinarian on site to administer that shot. We have a vet who comes in on Thursdays and on Mondays typically to make sure that all the animals are getting their physical fitness exams and to administer things like rabies vaccines if an animal was surrendered without having an active vaccine. However, we will never have an animal who is suspected to have rabies on the floor for adoption. So you won't be at risk of working with any animals who we suspect might be rabid. Again, this is just a protocol that we have to follow for the health department to ensure that we are that we're kind of maintaining our role as a community steward and keeping everyone as safe and healthy as possible. Now, if a bite or a scratch doesn't break skin, please still tell a staff member. It could be useful in terms of deliberating which pathway the animal should have at the shelter. It might mean that if a cat is prone to biting or scratching when they're overstimulated, it might be play biting and scratching, and they might not do it very hard, but it might mean that they shouldn't go home with a family who has a young child at home because children sometimes have a little bit more difficulty with honoring an animal's boundaries because they haven't yet learned those boundaries. So it is useful information for us to determine which home an animal should go to. On the next two slides here, I have our what we consider non-emergencies in terms of animal health versus what we consider emergencies in terms of animal health. In both of these events, we ask you to notify a staff member, but if there's an emergency situation on hand, we ask that you notify a staff member as soon as possible. An example of that might be if you're working with a dog and they're in a higher up kennel and they happen to somehow bolt out of the kennel and they fall to the floor. None of our kennels are so high that that's going to be an immediately super destructive thing. But anytime an animal suffers a kind of fall from a higher level, we do want to make sure that there are no immediate physical consequences of that. So that would be considered a potential trauma, and so that would be an emergency that you would just want to find a staff member as soon as possible after you have secured the animal and have them do maybe a quick evaluation for that animal. Now, for a lot of these things, you will note that There are time periods attached to them, so decreased appetite for less than 24 hours, diarrhea not improving or worsening after 24 to 48 hours. Unless you are fostering animals with us, you are likely not going to be spending that long of a time period with the animals. So from your perspective, when you're looking at these lists, and you will have access to this presentation after the presentation, so you'll be able to refer back to these. But for your purposes, if you're noticing that when you come into the shelter, like two-tone Tony always has his food bowl quite full when all of the other cats around him have empty food bowls, that's something that's a little bit off potentially. So maybe let us know because it might be an evidence of decreased appetite. We will, of course, be monitoring the animals as well, but the more pairs of eyes that we can have on them, typically, the better. And again, we just always want to be noting any physical health concerns to a staff member as soon as we see them. In terms of sanitization at the shelter, we use an all-purpose non-toxic disinfectant called Rescue. It also has the name Excel, so if you see Excel around the shelter, know that it's the same thing as Rescue. But we use that as the primary cleaner when we're working with animal kennels and soiled equipment. You will very rarely need to clean the kennels themselves. Our animal care staff typically do that. The only time that we would have volunteers working on that assignment is if we were short-staffed and we would post those opportunities in Volgistics. But we do want to make sure that we're washing our hands and using hand sanitizer between enrichment activities with different animals. And we also want to make sure that if we're working with the dogs in the dog yard, that we're using that rescue to clean up any messes. We'll go over how to do that during your on-site training shift. And we also use rescue to clean hard toys like a rubber Kong that a dog might be playing with. We will usually do a rescue bath to disinfect it between animals so that animals are not potentially sharing germs. We're going to pivot now into talking about general animal body language. We're going to talk about dogs first, and then we are going to talk about cats. But it's important to note that animals are going to display signs of fear, anxiety, and stress in their body language. And we're going to look generally for signs in several key places. So we're going to look to the animal's face, their eyes, their spine or general posture, their tail, the way they're carrying their tail, the way they're holding their mouth, and the way they're holding their ears. Those areas, if we can analyze them, are going to give a lot of valuable feedback in terms of how an animal is feeling at any given time. And typically, if we see tension manifesting in those places, that's going to be a sign of fear, anxiety, or stress. Whereas if we see signs of relaxation in those areas, that's going to be a sign of calm. Now, there are some signs like tail wagging, which are an indication of excitement. That might be joyful excitement, it might be anxious excitement. So we need to be able to parse how an animal is feeling. And the more experience we get doing so, the better we'll get at it. Sometimes dogs and cats have similar signs for telling us that they're stressed or calm. For example, both dogs and cats will lick their lips when they're uncomfortable. Um, However, sometimes the signs are different, and sometimes the way that we want to engage with the animals is different. With dogs, we typically want to focus our petting on their shoulders, under their chins, kind of on their chest, rather than petting them immediately on their head. Whereas with cats, as we'll talk about, it's the opposite. So we're going to dig into all of that stuff now. And we're going to talk about dogs first. This is a picture of Mochi, who was adopted from the shelter more than a year and a half ago at this point, but she was one of the first dogs that I got to see adopted from the shelter, which was a great experience. She's feeling pretty comfortable and calm at home with a foster in this picture here. So we're going to talk about what some signs are that a dog is frightened or angry or stressed, or that they generally need some space, as well as some signs that a dog is happy or relaxed or approachable or engaged or playful. So on these two slides, I've got a summary of what dogs tend to look like when they're frightened and angry and stressed versus what dogs tend to look like when they're approachable or engaged. And if we're looking for kind of high level takeaways here, we can see a lot more tension manifesting in the bodies of the dogs. Of course, these are little cartoon depictions, but I think they're very useful. But we see a lot more tension, a lot more guardedness, a lot more either hanging back and trying to fade into the environment or kind of standing their ground and trying to make somebody else stand down. Whereas with these dogs, we see a lot of movement lines. Dogs are very wiggly when they're feeling relaxed and happy. We see some tail wagging. We see a lot more dogs kind of approaching, and a lot more relaxation generally in the bodies. Some general behavioral signs that a dog is feeling happy versus frightened or nervous versus defensive and aggressive. So happy dogs will have soft eyes with no whites visible. They'll have neutral ears. So their ears won't be up at high alert. They won't be back, potentially anticipating a fight. They'll have an open, smiling mouth, a relaxed body. Their hair coat will be lying flat, so their hackles won't be raised on the between their shoulders or along their spine. And they'll also have neutral tail carriage typically. Happy dogs will also sometimes have wagging tails, but we always do want to be on guard to assess whether a wagging tail might be coming from nervousness or whether it might be coming from a joyful excitement. Mochi is doing a really great job here of indicating all of those calm signs here. So open, smiling mouth, uh, eyes that are soft where we don't see the whites of her eyes visible. It's just iris and pupil that we're seeing there. Her ears or maybe back a little bit as she's making room to accommodate the head pet. This is obviously somebody who has built trust with her, but for the most part, those ears are kind of relaxed there. She's lying in a way that exposes her flank, so she's showing us some vulnerability. So she's very relaxed in this picture here. Frightened or nervous dogs, on the other hand, that's where you'll see tension in the mouth and body. You'll see the dog licking their lips potentially or averting their gaze, which is what often causes that whale eyeing, which is also listed here, which is where we see a lot of the whites of the dog's eyes. Frightened or nervous dogs might lay their ears back. They might tremble or bark or whine or shut down or turn their head or body away. So in this case, a frightened or nervous dog is afraid of what is happening in front of them potentially. And so they're trying to do their best to make themselves inconspicuous. They're trying to kind of melt into the environment and throw as little attention on themselves as possible. So they're trying to say, I'm scared. You're scaring me. Please leave me alone. Look, I'm not even a threat. I'm not interesting. Please go away. With the defensive or aggressive dogs, the way their body posture changes between frightened and nervous dogs is that they are actively kind of saying, stand down, I'm scary, I want you to know that, and I want you to back off because of it. That defensiveness and aggressiveness might be coming from, or defensiveness and aggression might be coming from potential fear to start with. But these dogs are taking a much more active role in terms of maintaining their own space bubble. So that's where you might see tension in the mouth and body still, of course. But here's where you'll see a lot of growling. Barking is not necessarily an indication of aggression by any means. A lot of the dogs are going to be barking at you just to solicit pets and to get your attention. But growling is where we really start to see dogs who are feeling defensive or aggressive, definitely baring of teeth. If they are lunging or feint biting or actually making contact and biting, those are all indications that a dog is willing to kind of keep their space sacred by any means possible. So we want to especially have an eye for the dog's boundaries in those cases. So when we're evaluating different dogs' body posture, we're going to go through a couple examples here. But if we took a look at this dog and how they might be feeling, there are several things that we want to kind of note here. So first and foremost, the dog's paws are kind of down on the ground, head is low, butt is hiked up in the air. That is a universal sort of sign in dog body language that we call the play bow, that is indicating that this dog is excited, ready for play. We can see that the dog also has soft eyes, so none of the whites of their eyes are visible. Open, smiling mouth. Those ears are neutral. The tail carriage is pretty neutral for this breed of dog. And we can't see incredibly well because of the angle of the picture, but it doesn't look like the hair along their back or spine is standing on end. So all of the signs that this dog is communicating to us are telling us that they are feeling excited to play. Um, Sometimes it's not going to be as obvious as this. Not all of the signs are going to line up in the same way. Dogs and cats can feel ambivalent just like we do. They might be pulled in two emotional directions. A puppy might be really excited about meeting a new person at the same time that they're also kind of scared about meeting a new person. So they might be alternately tucking their tail and then sometimes wagging their tail. So we want to be able to kind of break down and analyze those individual parts so that we can get a full and cohesive picture of how the animal is feeling. Because if we have a dog who is exposing their belly and kind of wiggling around and has an open, smiling mouth, that's an indication that they want us to pet their belly. However, if we have a dog who is showing us their belly and is very tense and is looking at us with wide eyes, and we're seeing a lot of the whites of their eyes and they're licking their lips, that's a dog saying, I'm very scared of you right now. I'm showing you vulnerability so that you'll leave me alone. So we always want to be able to parse those different signs because the same body posture, the same general body posture might be complicated in the specifics. If we look at this dog and how they're feeling, this is an example of a potentially more ambiguous situation because the dog and the kid seem to be feeling different ways. But this is an instance of a dog who is feeling very uncomfortable and is using every polite and civil tool in their toolkit to say, I'm uncomfortable. So we see a ton of tension in the dog's general body posture. They seem to be leaning away from this embrace as much as they possibly can. They are in the middle of licking their lips, which, as we talked about, is a sign of discomfort. They're kind of looking off into the distance, and we see the whites of their eyes, so they're whale eyeing. There's a lot of tension in that jaw, despite the fact that the dog is licking their lips. And then the ears are also holding a lot of tension. So this child doesn't have a really great grasp of this dog's boundaries right now, and is unintentionally doing something that's making the dog very uncomfortable. The dog is being very good and tolerant and civil about this. But the next shot that we might see if the child continues not to heed those boundaries is potentially this dog snapping at the kid. So we always want to make sure that we are reading the signs, and if we're making a dog feel kind of tense and uncomfortable, that we're changing our behavior so that we can make them feel more comfortable. This picture is less ambiguous, right? There's one of the dogs is featured much more prominently. The other dog is largely off screen, but they are making hard, direct eye contact, which in dog body language is aggressive posturing. If they're making hard, sustained eye contact, that's an indication that this is a legitimate confrontation. Play fighting can sometimes look pretty rough with dogs. But this we can get a sense as an indication of real aggression because of that eye contact, because of those snarls. We see the teeth bared in both dogs. Every muscle in the German Shepherd's face is kind of tensed. We see the ears back, which is something both dogs and cats do when they're potentially expecting a fight so that they don't get their ears torn in that fight. Tail carriage is very atypical for a calm German Shepherd here. That tail is like up over their body and kind of puffed up even. So everything here is indicating that this is a legitimate confrontation, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we want to avoid when working with the animals at the shelter. The best way to do that is by honoring their boundaries, and also, as we'll talk about in a little bit, by keeping the dogs 3 to 4 feet away from other dogs at all times. Now, in terms of how we're taught to approach a dog, sometimes we inherit some really great lessons and sometimes we inherit some subpar lessons. So we're going to talk about some methods of approach that are commonly executed but are maybe not the best first. And then we'll talk about better ways to approach a dog for a first time. So when people are approaching a dog for the first time, they often think that it's a good idea to stick out their hands to let the dog smell them. That's coming from a really great understanding about how dogs interact with their space, right? Because dogs get a lot of information about the world around them from their sense of smell. However, because a dog's sense of smell is so strong, they do not need us to put out our hands to let them smell us. If we're in the same room as them, maybe even if we're in the next room over, they can get a sense of our smell just by the strength of their own sensory capacities. So sticking out our hand to let a dog smell us is at best redundant. They don't need us to do that. At worst, it can be a potential trigger for them, depending on how quickly we put our hand out. For some dogs who have a history of abuse or trauma, that might be a potential trigger. And if nothing else, it might just be an incursion into their space. They're like, why are you putting your hand near my face? That's kind of odd and it's potentially a little bit threatening from my perspective. We want to focus on other parts of the body rather than the head, especially when we're first meeting a dog to pet them. We don't want to default to a high-pitched voice, baby talk to talk to dogs. It feels so natural to slip into because we're so used to working with our own dogs with whom we've already built a ton of trust with. And when we use a high-pitched voice, it's to get them excited. And they know that that means play most of the time. But in the context of a shelter, you might be working with a dog who earlier that morning got vaccinated and now they're on edge because they got poked with a needle. And if you go using a high-pitched voice, using baby talk to get their attention, that might just key them up. That might trigger that anxiety. So you might see some signs of a heightened arousal state in the dog, but it might be because they're being made uncomfortable by that. So it's usually best to speak to a dog in a low voice. We want to avoid making sustained eye contact with the dogs. Again, in dog body language, that is defensive or aggressive posturing. When we approach strangers' dogs, we often think to ask the stranger for consent to pet their dog, but we don't so much think about the dog's consent in the situation. Dogs can, of course, give us consent in the same way that their companion at the park could, um, but it's going to be in a different way, right? So dogs and cats are going to express their consent, not verbally most of the time, like we would with each other, but they're going to express their consent in their bodies. And so we want to make sure that when we're approaching a stranger's dog, we are honoring the dog's boundaries as much as we are honoring their companion's boundaries in that situation, because they're arguably even more important. On this slide, we have some better ways to approach dogs. So especially if you're meeting a dog for the first time, especially if you're making that first impression, some things that we want to do are kneeling and turning to the side. That offsets the kind of space differential between you and the dog. It brings you down to their level. It's kind of like an olive branch, and offering that you are not there to kind of cause them any harm, but that you are interested in them. You want to turn to the side. You always want to be offsetting your body posture when working with dogs. So always being slightly askance from them so that you're not bearing head down upon them, which is seen as potentially aggressive behavior. You want to keep your face up and away from the dog's face at all times. It's going to be so tempting to let the dog lick you and give you kisses, but we want to avoid doing that for the most part. Even the most well-intentioned puppy might go for a nip. And we want to make sure that dogs are never jumping up and muzzle punching us in the face because we don't want to have any broken noses. So if you're kneeling down, especially to work with the dogs, always keep your face up and away from their face. It's great to walk up slowly to them, to speak softly. And the cardinal rule about interacting with dogs or cats is to allow them to approach you. You want them to choose the situation. You don't want to chase them down in the yard and force them into a situation that they're not interested in. And a great way to do that is to follow this mnemonic here. It's presented for children specifically, but I think it has a lot of wisdom in it for children and adults, but it's pat, pet, pause. So the idea is that when you're approaching a dog for the first time, you kind of maybe kneel down in the yard, you pat your knee to call the dog over to you. If they come over to you, that's awesome. Pet them on their body, but not on their head directly. So on their shoulder, under their chin, on their side. These are all great places to begin petting. And then very importantly, we want to pause. Pet them for 2 to 3 seconds, then pause, give them an opportunity to leave if they want to leave the situation. A lot of the time, the dog is going to look up at you and be like, why the heck did you stop petting me? They'll maybe put their paws up on you to solicit more pets. But for a lot of dogs, it's going to be really important to have that pause because they get to choose the opportunity. So a dog might be interested in meeting a new person, but they might be kind of nervous about new people. So after you pet them for a couple seconds, they might be like, okay, that went well. I liked that. I'm going to go over and smell this bench to calm down a little bit, and then maybe I'll circle back. But you want to kind of respond to their lead so that you're making sure to honor their boundaries and consent. We also, again, want to avoid making direct, sustained eye contact, and it's so important that we let the dog approach us on their own time. The next several slides are going to be things that we will emphasize a lot during your on-site training because these are kind of things that will require a more kind of like physical um, a more physical component. You'll need to actually observe them being practiced. But we will go over some of the important things here. So when we're working with the dogs at the shelter, the first thing that I want to note is that it can be pretty overwhelming. You'll have a lot of dogs barking at you all at once, and it can be kind of difficult at first to parse out how an individual dog is feeling within the overarching context of all of that kind of jockeying for your attention. But it is a skill that you will develop over time. And what you kind of want to aim for as the ideal is that you and the dog that you're working with are the only dog in the room. You want to be patient with them when you're getting them out of the kennel. You want to kind of let everything in the background fade away, not to the extent that you're no longer aware of what's happening in the background. You want to make sure that you are keeping the dog as safe as possible and that you're navigating them around other kennels where dogs might be barking or growling aggressively. But you ideally want to just make that one dog your whole world, kind of really focus in on them for just that moment when you're getting them out to the yard. And if you do that, if you're calm and patient, things will always go really smoothly for the most part. Uh, One of the primary things that we want you to keep in mind is to ask for help if you need it. Some dogs look very strong. Some dogs are much stronger than they look. Some dogs look really strong and they're even stronger than what it seems. So if you have a dangerous situation on hand because a really tough dog bolted out of their kennel and now they're running around and barking at all the other dogs and you're stressed and the dogs seem stressed, yell for help. We'll always have animal care staff on the adoption floor as well as other staff kind of wandering all throughout the shelter. So if you need help, ask for it anytime you have a dangerous or overwhelming situation on hand. When we're returning dogs to their kennel, when we're removing dogs from their kennel, anytime we're working with the dogs, we want to minimize any force that we're using with them. Ideally, we want to use none at all. So if a dog is hesitant about returning to their kennel or coming out of it, a much better way to work with them is to coax them into their kennel with treats or coax them out of their kennel with treats. We never want to push them or drag them from point A to point B because we want to be honoring their space, and we don't want to be provoking any sort of defensiveness in the dog. We don't ever want to enter a kennel with a dog. Don't ever do that. If you're having trouble getting a dog back into a kennel and they're not very food motivated and not interested in the treats, ask a staff member for help. Um, We always want to return dogs to the same kennels from which they came so that we can minimize any risk of disease transfer. And we also want to double check the paperwork outside of their kennel for any important information. A dog might have a sign that says ask a staff member before handling, which you will want to follow that instruction because those are usually dogs who exhibit higher levels of fear, anxiety, or stress in the shelter, and they might require additional training to work with. You will want to look for what color the dog is coded as. When you come in for your on-site training, we will talk about what those color codings mean and who can work with which level dogs. But it's always important that you're working with the dogs that you are trained to work with, as well as working with the cats that you're trained to work with. If you see a sign on a kennel that says, hey, I have an upper respiratory infection, please make sure to work with me last. Make sure to work with that dog last so that we can clean the yard after working with them and so that we're not potentially bringing other dogs out into the yard after a dog who has a URI because we want to make sure that those aren't spreading. Walk length is generally 15 minutes to an hour, depending on the weather, depending on how the dog is feeling, depending on how much time you have, and also depending on whether or not it is an adoption day. On adoption days, 15 minutes is the max, but on non-adoption days, you can take them for longer walks. We only ever handle or walk one dog at a time, including in the dog yard. So there are some very limited exceptions to when we can have multiple dogs in the dog yard, typically if they're litter mates, so brother and sister, or if they are pair bonded at the shelter. But unless you have explicit permission from the staff to take them out to the yard together, we will not take them out to the yard together because we want to make sure that dogs who are unfamiliar with each other are not potentially getting into any dangerous fights. On walks, we only ever walk one dog at a time because they need to be the sole subject of our attention. Um, if you're working with the dogs, the kind of cardinal rule when you're working with them is to always assume that they don't get along with others. That might be an improper assumption to make. It might be you might be working with a very friendly dog. However, we're always going to assume that they won't get along with others so that we're not provoking any sort of surprise incidents. We want to always keep every dog a safe distance away from other dogs of at least 3 to 4 feet. We avoid dog parks, and we want to be on watch for possible fights or indications of aggression because fights are dangerous. We don't want you to be in a situation where you have to kind of deal with one as it erupts. And we want to make sure that we're keeping the dogs as safe as possible as well. So the best way that we can do that is to always keep them a safe distance from other dogs. And we want to stay alert when we're working with the dogs, keep our attention on the dog that we're walking, and avoid using cell phones or headphones or any sort of distracting equipment. If you're trying to get a picture of a dog with your phone, that's completely okay. Just make sure that in those moments when you might have your guard down a little bit, like when you're turning a corner or taking a picture or stooping to pick up the dog's poop, just make sure that you're on the lookout, that you're maintaining a situational awareness, that if there's another dog rounding the corner coming down the street, you're aware of that, so you're keeping them a safe distance away. We provide waste bags and treat bags and water bottles, so all the equipment that you'll need for a walk at the shelter. So you won't ever have to bring those with you to the shelter. If you're noticing that an animal is responding adversely to the weather, like if a dog is really panting out in the heat, or in the winter, if they are doing a lot of shivering, we want to return them to the kennel as soon as we start to see those signs, and we want to make sure that they have whatever resource they might need. So let an animal care staff know. We can get them additional blankets. We can get them additional water if they need, so that we're making sure to keep them safe from the elements. If you're walking a dog and the dog bites another dog or a person, report that immediately to a Morris Animal Care attendant. And as soon as you can safely disengage from that situation, we would want you to return to the main shelter. And in general, when you're working with the dogs, the more aware that you are of what's happening, the more likely it is that you'll be able to avoid any dangerous situations. You will absolutely have fun working with the dogs. They're lovely. But we also want you to remember that you're their guardians when you're working with them, and that they need you to be checked into what's happening around them so that you're keeping yourself and them safe. So we're going to talk about cats now. This portion is going to be a little bit briefer because a lot of the things that we talked about regarding consent with animals are going to double for cats the same way that it did for dogs. However, we are going to talk about some of the important distinctions, and then after we talk about cats, we will wrap up and talk about what the next steps look like for volunteering at the shelter. So this is a picture of Pesto, who was previously named Tiger, who was adopted from the shelter around the same time that Mochi was, and just like Mochi is feeling really comfortable at home with a foster in this photo. But in terms of some of the signs that a cat is frightened or angry or stressed versus what they look like when they're happy or playful or approachable, happy cats tend to purr. They tend to headbutt or scent mark with their face. They might swish their tails long and slow. They might greet us with lowered heads. They might slow blink as a sign of trust. All of these things are cats telling us that they are comfortable with us in their space, and that they're interested in making a connection. Frightened or nervous cats, on the other hand, might tense or freeze in place. Cats have a very refined hide instinct. It comes from the kind of their physiology. They're mesopredators, so they're used to being both predator and prey in the wild. So they have very refined hide instinct. So even a non-nervous cat might be kind of hanging out in their litter box or hanging out behind their cat curtain at the shelter, just to flex those instincts. But certainly, if a cat is actively hiding in their litter box, that's an indication that they're frightened or nervous. If a cat's flattening their ears or crouching or lowering their tail or licking their lips, those are all indications of frightened or nervous cats. And like we said with the dogs, that's an animal trying to kind of melt into the environment, throw as much suspicion and interest off of themselves as possible so that you ignore them because you're making them scared. Defensive and aggressive cats, that's where we start seeing hissing, growling, displaying their teeth, flattening their ears, arching their back, standing sideways to appear larger, rapidly swishing a lowered tail, yowling or biting or scratching or lunging. So again, these are cats who are making themselves look as big and intimidating as possible and are saying, hey, I need you out of my space and I am willing to make that happen. The choice is no longer up to you. We want to keep an eye on what is differentiating a frightened and nervous cat versus a defensive or aggressive cat. We have the same way that we did with the dogs, some kind of cartoon images illustrating what cats look like when they're approachable and engaged versus what they look like when they're more frightened or stressed. And we can see even more so than with the dogs, because cats' body posture is often so relaxed and so fluid, because their bodies are so flexible, tension manifests, I think, even more obviously. And relaxation is almost even more obvious in their bodies as well, the way they hold themselves, than it is with dogs. So with these cats, we can see that all of their ears are perked forward. They're all interested and attentive for the most part. They're all kind of looking at us. Their tails are held high or at mid-level, and there's not a lot of tension being carried in their tails, or their tail is kind of gently wrapped around them. We can see the trusting cat is exposing their belly. Unlike with dogs, a lot of the time when a dog exposes their belly, it can be an invitation for petting their belly. With cats, it is rarely an invitation. Some cats do love belly rubs. You shouldn't assume that a cat loves belly rubs, and you might break the trust that they're extending to you if you go in to pet the belly that they've shown you. So you just want to make sure that you're honoring their boundaries and just keeping in mind showing their belly is great. Make sure that you're not going in to pet the belly typically. Frightened or angry or stressed cats, on the other hand, we can see so evidently the tension carried in these cats' bodies. They're crouching to make themselves look so tiny and coiled and tight, or they're making themselves look as large as possible by arching their backs and bristling their fur and holding their tail up and bristling their tail. This is all giving us an indication that they are trying to make us back down, or that they are trying to call attention off of themselves. You can tell a ton about how a cat is feeling by looking at their tail. If they're holding their tail high or at mid-level and it's relaxed, that's an indication that they're feeling friendly or amicable or content. If they're tucking their tail or holding it down, or coiled really tightly against them, that's usually a sign that they are upset, potentially feeling compromised. If their tail is directly up and bristled, or if they're holding a lot of tension in their tail and they're holding it up, that's usually a sign that they are feeling defensive or startled or really scared in their environment. If they're kind of gently swishing their tail, that's an indication of relaxation and comfort. But if they're thumping their tail, or if they are twitching their tail rapidly, that's an indication that they're at best irritated or at worst potentially feeling kind of aggressive. We can also notice that the cats are all doing airplane ears. They're all holding their ears back so they look like the wings of an airplane on these frames to indicate that they are feeling frightened, angry, or stressed. When we look at a cat's body posture, we'll use this cat as an example in terms of how they're feeling. But we can get a really clear indication here that the cat is feeling very uncomfortable. They're potentially feeling defensive here because we see that ears back, they're doing airplane ears. The pupils are slightly dilated. The light level looks weird in the room, so that might be why the pupils are a little bit larger. But the cat is also stressed. So when we see enlarged pupils, that's an indication that a cat is feeling stressed or potentially on edge. We can see that the whiskers of the cat are flared, that they're actively hissing, that their tail is coiled tight against them. Their back is arched, but they're making themselves look as small as possible. They're kind of like backing themselves into a corner, it looks like. And we can also see that their paws are right propped up underneath of them. So if they need to jump forward and attack, they have that option open. If they need to leap backward and flee, they have that option open. They're poised to respond to a stimulus that is freaking them out. They seem to be actively hissing. So all of the things that this cat is doing in this situation are communicating to us that they're feeling very uncomfortable and they need us to back away from them. When we're working with cats at the shelter, we can never allow them onto the floor in the cat rooms. They should never, ever, ever be free roaming around on the floor. That's very dangerous for them because we have dogs who go from the dog rooms to the front lobby to exit the shelter for walks, and they pass the cat room. So we never want a negative interaction between a dog and a cat. So they can't be on the floor in the cat rooms. We do want to keep their body language in mind to assess their mood the same way that we do for the dogs. If they are defensive, we want to give them space. We want to give them time to adjust to our presence, just like we do with dogs, and we want them to lead the interaction. We don't want to invade their safe zone. When we're approaching a cat, this is one of the fundamental ways that they differ from dogs, but it actually is good with cats to tentatively raise our fingers or our hands and to allow them to smell us, because that gives them an opportunity to kind of get to know us a little bit better. They'll usually respond with a cheek rub up against our finger or our hand if they're interested in pursuing an interaction with us. We also want to focus petting on their heads. So that's different than what we talked about with dogs as well. We want to pet them on their foreheads with cats or their cheeks or their chins. We usually want to avoid petting their flanks or their backs or their belly or chest. We don't want to really do those full body from head to tail pets. A lot of cats are going to find that really uncomfortable. Again, it has to do with their physiology. They have really, really sensitive sensory networks. And usually, if we're touching their bodies, they're cued, they're primed because of their physiology to think that that's a potential threat. So at best, even if they're working with a trusting person, that's going to be an uncomfortable feeling for them if you're petting them in a place that they're very sensitive. We want to reinforce positive behavior with cats with treats. So if we're working with a cat and they're really scared of us, but through some patience and from talking with them for a little bit and focusing them out, we get them to approach us. That's really great. And we want to reward that with treats so that they come to anticipate those positive interactions at the shelter and that they know that they might get a nice, tasty reward if they approach people. That's going to make them much more likely to get adopted because they'll be much more interested to come to the front of their kennels. When we're working with the cats at the shelter, as well as in our day-to-day lives, when we're picking a cat up, we want to make sure that we're supporting their whole body with our hands. We want to place one hand under their front legs and one hand under their hind legs so that we're preventing their legs from dangling. We also want to apply gentle pressure against our body to make the cat feel secure. A lot of the time when somebody gets scratched holding a cat, it's because the cat was feeling very insecure. Their legs were maybe dangling. They thought that they were going to fall. And so they use their claws to scrabble up the person's chest or their shoulder to find purchase. Um, so if we're holding them in the way that they like to be held, making them feel secure, it's much less likely that they're going to feel the need to do that. When we're working with cats at the shelter, we don't ever want to scruff them by picking them up by their neck or their shoulder skin. And we also never, ever, ever want to pick a cat up by their legs or by their tail. That is a really surefire way to injure them. So never do that. I think for a lot of people that is pretty obvious, but it is worth noting. And then finally, if we're working with a nervous or frozen or aggressive cat and we're concerned about picking them up or we need to rekennel them, one of the things that we can do is wrap a towel around them to help calm them down a little bit and block some of the sensory stimulus that's freaking them out, as well as to help to prevent them from biting or scratching. So this might happen if you're working at the shelter and a cat out of nowhere bolts out of the kennel, you always want to make sure that you are minimizing their opportunity to do that by putting your body in the way of them doing so. But accidents can happen. If a cat bolts out of the kennel and now they're crouching in the corner of the room, hissing, and you're getting a sense that they're nervous or frozen or aggressive, you can use a towel to rekennel them. You can also call a staff member for help, yell that there's a loose cat and that you need help as soon as possible. Um, this tip is also useful for if you're trying to get your own cat into the kennel so that you can take them to the vet, for example. It's always a great technique to use linens or towels to calm them down and prevent them from biting or scratching. All of the cats at the shelter will have linens and towels in their kennels. So if you're working with the cats in the cat room, you'll have ready access to those. That's going to conclude our animal body language portion. And so we've just got a couple of kind of final check-in things here. So Volgistics is our volunteer management software that we use at the shelter. You are going to be able to create a Volgistics account, and then once we have approved it, you will be able to log into our volunteer portal so that you can track your hours and sign up for shifts. You will receive these links via an email after today's presentation. And I want to just iterate that Volgistics is really the best tool that we have for showing off all the awesome work that you all do. So please make sure when you're coming into the shelter to sign in and to sign out, because recording your hours is really vital for the growth and expansion of our programming. It's what allows me to make a case for expansion if we're really excelling in one certain area, so that we can make sure that we're always growing at the shelter and giving the animals all of the support and care that they could possibly need. After after you finish viewing this video, you will have received a quiz that you will take as a follow-up to the video. Once you have submitted that quiz and gotten a 100% on it, you will need a 100% on it to get follow-up emails from us. However, you can take the quiz as many times as you need. But you will get a survey link to provide feedback on how you think this video helped to prepare you. You'll get a link to set up your Volgistics account so that you can begin signing up for shifts and tracking your service at the shelter. Once you have submitted your application, it'll usually take me 2 to 3 days on my end to approve your account, depending on if you submitted it like over a weekend or something. But then you will receive that account. It'll be activated. You'll get links to access our shared documents, which will include this slideshow. We will request in a follow-up email that you send proof of your COVID vaccination status. And that you also sign our waiver, but those are also two things that you can do when you come in for your on-site training. You can provide that vaccination status and you can sign our waiver. And then once we have activated your Volgistics account, you're going to receive an email with instructions for signing up for your on-site training shift, which will be the final part of the volunteer onboarding process. So once you've completed that on-site training shift, then we will be all set. You will be able to come in from that point and sign up for any shifts that you're interested in working at the shelter. You'll always be able to log into Volgistics to see what is available. And you'll be able from that point to volunteer with very minimal additional training or anything on that end. These are the pictures and resources that I use throughout the presentation here. And any questions that you have following today's orientation, I certainly want you to feel welcome to ask. You can send those to volunteering@morrisanimalrefuge.org. That is the original email from which you received communication from us. And it's the email that you'll receive any communications from. So you should have access to it. But again, it is volunteering@morrisanimalrefuge.org in case you have any questions. I'm really very thankful that you're interested in volunteering at the shelter, and I can't wait to meet you during your on-site training and to get you oriented to work at the shelter and to be working alongside of you. Thank you so much for all that you do for the community's animals. And again, I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much.